Agrarian South Network. Today's topic is COVID-19, intensifying the existential threat to the Caribbean. And our most distinguished speaker is Dr. Michael Witter. For this conversation, we have Dr. Lina Some as the discussant, and of course, everyone can chip in our conversation, which follows these two very, very distinguished presenters. The core partners for the dialogue series are Agrarian South Network, the Sam Moyo African Institute for Agrarian Studies, and ActionAid India. We also have a few very well-known supporting partners, which include Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies at JNU, Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana, Global University for Sustainability, Hong Kong, China, postgraduate program in World Political Economy, and the Educational Technologies and Languages Unit, both at the Federal University of ABC, Sao Paulo, Brazil. This dialogue would be in English, but questions can be asked either on the Zoom or Facebook in other languages also. These should be the written questions, which will be translated and forwarded to me by our wonderful volunteers. The recorded video of the program will appear later with Portuguese and Spanish subtitles. So that was about the logistics regarding the dialogue for today. And as I said, Dr. Michael Witter is the keynote speaker for this. Michael was employed by the University of West Indies, Mona, for almost 4 decades, more than that, formerly in the Department of Economics, and in the recent years as a senior research fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies. During these years, Michael has been a visiting professor at several US universities and served as secondment to the National Planning Agency, since renamed the Planning Institute of Jamaica. He was awarded a PhD in economics well before many of you were born, in 1974 by the University of Wisconsin, for his work on the export-propelled growth of small economies. Since then, his research interests have ranged across many areas, broadly a whole range of development problems, such as economic growth, exchange rate management, poverty, food, culture, energy, labor, youth, climate change. So, you can see from this brief description that Michael is very much a Renaissance intellectual. He has worked across many sectors: agriculture, informal economy, housing, tourism, across small island developing states, primarily in the Caribbean, but globally as well. Since 2009, he has authored several reports on the feasibility of renewable energy and climate change, issues like greening of the economy. In other words, questions which have become very much central to our existence today. Again, much of the focus has been on the Jamaica and the wider Caribbean, but then these have wide-ranging implications. The most recent research projects are on the greening of the Caribbean economies as a strategy for development and the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. He has consulted with several international and regional organizations, agencies of the government of Jamaica, private companies, organizations of civil societies over the last many decades. Let me stop here, otherwise I will end up talking for another half an hour about Michael. As regards our discussant, Lynn, she's a senior research fellow at the Makerere Institute of Social Research, Makerere University, where she teaches politics and feminist political economy. She is author of, very recently, a book, Gender, Ethnicity and Violence in Kenya's Transition to Democracy, States of Violence. And she's co-editor of a forthcoming volume on labor questions in the Global South. She has published widely, is a well-known scholar. She is associated with our network, Agrarian South Network, for long. She is one of the associate editors of Agrarian South, Journal of Political Economy, which is the journal of our network. She also happens to be co-editor of the Journal of Contemporary African Studies, serves on several boards, among them CODESTRIA, which is Council for Development for Social Science Research in Africa, and International Association for Feminist Economics. So welcome both Michael and Lynn. And with that, let me request Michael to take the floor, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Praveen. I have to share my screen. Let me see, share my screen. But the host has disabled, okay, yes, okay. Do I have the option to share my screen?
Yeah, please carry on.
Okay. All right. Okay, fine. Okay, slideshow. From the beginning. Okay, so thanks, Praveen, and good morning, good afternoon, good night to colleagues, friends, comrades from all over planet Earth. I am talking to you from my center of the universe to your center of the universe. And I'm really privileged to be participating in this global conversation at a critical time in human history. The conversation within the Caribbean has already begun. It is still in its early stages. And so, in a sense, I'm walking on two legs here, which is to make a contribution to the reasoning as we refer to conversations in the Caribbean, and Jamaica in particular, to make a contribution to the reasoning in the Caribbean while making a contribution to the reasoning globally. It's by chance that I come to make this presentation short next after Professor Jayati Ghosh, who made such a beautiful presentation the last time, coming from the perspective of large societies primarily. I'll be coming from the perspective of very, very small societies, but one could argue that these societies have punched above their weight level in global affairs, and that there's a lot to learn from them. So I'm hoping that the contribution here will stimulate thinking, both with respect to the Caribbean's particular problems, as well as cast a prism of some sort into issues more widely relevant to the rest of the planet. So, as you heard, I will be speaking to the issue of how COVID has intensified the threat, the existential threat to the Caribbean, really and truly to speak more about how to address that threat, which I think is a more important thing. Really just to set up what the threat is about, what we mean by the threat, and to spend more time thinking about ways in which this can be addressed and managed in some sense. So I want to speak about COVID in the CARICOM Caribbean. And that's basically the English-speaking Caribbean plus Haiti plus Suriname. But that it obviously has wider implications for the whole Caribbean. There are many ways in which one can think about the Caribbean. In its widest, you would want to think of the entire Caribbean basin, which would include the rims of the basin, which are North, Central, and South America. There are many distinctively Caribbean communities on the coasts of Latin America, places like Colombia, for example, Nicaragua, and some of the countries within CARICOM Caribbean are actually in Central and South America. So it is I have in mind the entire Caribbean, but I want to focus specifically on the English-speaking Caribbean. Because of the similarity of their experiences, and it's in a way it is easier to manage in a presentation like this. So I'm not going to refer specifically to Cuba, which is really a special case here and so very important to all of us in the Caribbean, nor to the rest of the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. There's an estimate of about 45 million residents in the Caribbean in its widest interpretation, resident in the Caribbean. We don't include the diaspora in that estimate. And only about 6 million of us speak English. The rest speak Spanish and French. So we in the English-speaking Caribbean tend to project the view that the Caribbean is about English-speaking people, but it really, we are really the minority and will eventually suffer as a result of it. In a world that is becoming much more multilingual. But as I said, though small, the Caribbean as a whole, and the English-speaking Caribbean in particular, has really played an outsized role in global affairs. So it is worth speaking about them. And I will begin with a brief description of pre-COVID Caribbean. I learned that this was important many years ago from my dear friends in East Africa. I used to say to them, when I am on my island and I look out across the sea, I see the ship going down over the horizon. And I wondered, where was it falling to as a child? And I said, when you were a child in Tanzania and Kenya, what did you see when you looked far? And they said, oh, when we look north to Misri, which is what they used to call Egypt, we see where the sky touches the top of the trees. And my friends in East Africa were always wondering how I could live on such a small place and where I would run to in the event of a problem. And I will be speaking about some of those problems today. So it's important to give a brief description of the Caribbean in the pre-COVID period, a bit about the impact of COVID on public health in the region, then to say something about the impact on the economy and society. Time again restricts us because there's lots more that we could speak about, particularly the politics, and that will be a kind of a sub-theme in my discussions. And then I want to spend the rest of the time floating some ideas about charting a new normal. This is the spirit in which I understood the last presentation by Professor Ghosh. And I thought that this would give a different perspective on the general problem that human society faces at this time. So it is really about innovative thinking that I want to stimulate. And as I say, while I'm using the paradigm of the English-speaking Caribbean, and more often than not, Jamaica, even subconsciously, I think of Jamaica in my work as a metaphor for everything that can go good and everything that can go bad. It's a remarkable society in which we seem to have a little bit of everything. So it is really a metaphor, and the English-speaking Caribbean as a whole is itself a metaphor when we are discussing issues which I think apply to human beings wherever they live. So very briefly on the Caribbean, the people I'm speaking about, remember, while it is true for the whole region, especially for the English-speaking, primarily English-speaking, not only English-speaking, because in fact, CARICOM has Haiti and Suriname, and Haiti alone has twice the population of the English-speaking members of the community. So I'm talking about the CARICOM Caribbean. But as I suggest, there's a common history that we all share as colonies of Europe producing primary products. Basically, for a long time, sugar, bananas, cotton, but there have been other things along the way, like coffee. And that production has taken place with slave and subsequently indentured labor for export to Europe in this colonial phase. In an earlier period, Caribbean scholars have done a lot of work on dependency, focusing on the institutional form of the plantation. And there are many parallels with the version of the institution that existed in the Spanish Caribbean and indeed parts of Latin America called the hacienda. We won't be able to speak about that today, but that is the institutional framework within which production took place. What is important to stress, though, is that the Caribbean was the center of the world economy when it was formed. Because it is a fact that the world economy formed around the triangular trade, which brought Africans to the Caribbean to work as slaves. They produced sugar, which was then sent to Europe, and Europe in turn supplied manufacturers in this triangular trade to both Africa and the Caribbean. So in that sense, this is the first global economy. And today's version of globalization, parenthetically, the word globalization entered the dictionary in about 1992. This is several centuries after I am suggesting to you the Caribbean was the center of the world economy. And in fact, what is happening now is that the new expression of globalization is leaving the Caribbean behind. A region that was specialized for the center of the global economy is now finding that it is more and more irrelevant to the global economy. And therefore, one of the challenges it has is to find new ways to engage this global economy. But that common history of colonialism has left us with inequality, social and economic inequality, and environmental despoliation as endemic features in the region. Because it was a social system built on, as I suggested to you earlier, free labor, and later, that is unpaid labor rather, and subsequently cheap, low-wage labor, which means that poverty is endemic. And it is built on industries that paid no regard to the environment, simply cleared forests and polluted the land and rivers and so on, and in order to produce for export. And in that sense, environmental despoliation is endemic. What is also interesting about the Caribbean and difficult to explain, worth a discussion but in and of itself, is the coincidence of race and class, where what you have is a color-coded hierarchy with the working classes, those who are industrial workers and farmers and small farmers and peasants, being primarily of African and Asian origin, Asian meaning East Indian origin, and the capitalist classes being primarily of European and other ethnic minorities. And as you would expect, with these two extremes, the darker skinned people at the bottom and the fair skinned people at the top, in the middle is that blend of the two, born out of unequal relationships, which need to be discussed when you want to understand much of the gender relations and the violence in Caribbean society, because it goes back ultimately to relations between social unequals and, one could argue, in many instances, rape. Guyana and Trinidad are particular cases that need to be studied, because there you have pretty much fairly equal numbers of people of African descent and Indian descent, fairly equal split between them. And so what you have is an Afrocentric community that is class divided, and an Indo-centric community that is class divided. So you have a class structure within both groups, and then differences between the two groups, particularly around access to the government and to the benefits from the government. So that is a very important issue here in the Caribbean, and requires a lot of analysis to understand. After World War II, the economies begin to be differentiated into mineral exports, primarily oil and bauxite, but Guyana does a little gold too, and tourism, and some manufacturing, which was originally for the domestic market under a policy of import substitution. However, the traditional ties to the European metropoles were largely maintained, with the exception of the United States, where relations developed and with some countries came to dominate even the relations that had historically, traditionally existed with its own metropole. Jamaica is a good case in point, where with the development of bauxite production used to make aluminum, the expansion of the US economy in the post-World War II period for motor cars and consumer goods of one sort or another created a tremendous demand for bauxite, for aluminum, which in turn created a tremendous demand for bauxite. At the time, the French controlled most of the bauxite ores internationally, and the Americans and the British came to understanding for them to enter into the British Caribbean, in Jamaica in particular, which has a particularly rich bauxite ore, easy to mine and so on. So for that reason, the expansion of the consumer economy in the United States in the post-World War II tended to pull along a country like Jamaica and tied it even closer to the United States than England. One could say the same about tourism, whereas Jamaica is heavily dependent on tourism. Most of those tourists come from North America, USA and Canada, whereas Barbados, which has tended to maintain close relations with England, most of their tourists come from England and the rest of Europe. Also of note is, I just want to mention it here, but with the notion of creating a different perspective in mind, we should think of the Caribbean countries as archipelagos. That is, groups of islands. Take a place like Jamaica, for example, where we have about 65 islands, atolls, rocks, outcroppings, etc. But only the main island known as Jamaica is really inhabited. So there's a tendency, therefore, to view developmental problems as terrestrial, looking only at the main island. Whereas if we looked at it as an archipelago, then we would consider the space, the marine space between these various atolls and islets and so on, in which case our perception of the development problem for the country, development problem for the people is even wider. The development problem for the country would then naturally take on both a terrestrial and a marine dimension. The marine dimension has become popular with the British, with the World Bank promoting what it calls the blue economy. And we can touch on that later on. And the second thing is that there's a strong tradition of migration from the Caribbean, ultimately a push migration because of the difficulties of life in unpaid and later low wage, the majority of the population. And that migration has led primarily to the metropoles to which these colonies were attached. So the Haitians went to France, the Surinamese went to Holland, and the Barbadians and Trinidadians and Jamaicans and so on tended to go to England. But it's much broader than that now, but those are where you find the main communities in the Caribbean diaspora. And I might as well point out here that in broadening the perspective on development, beyond just the main island, within each of these archipelagos, to include the entire space circumscribed according to the law of the sea for each of these countries, one should also consider, especially nowadays with the facility for communication, to include the people of the diaspora within the Caribbean. And there you probably have an equal number of Caribbean people outside of the region, and speak more of human development in which they too have a considerable role and considerable resources to contribute to the development process. I'm sharing with you now a table to give some idea of the poverty in the region. You must take numbers coming from the Caribbean, and I'm sure for many countries, including big countries, with some amount of skepticism. Our capacity for measuring social reality is not very strong. It's obviously uneven, as all forms of development are, across the region. Fairly much stronger in a place like Jamaica than in some of the smaller countries. But these are the numbers that we are generally working with when looking at the head count for poverty. That is the number of people who live below the poverty line. As you see, the numbers can be quite large. In the case of Haiti, 59%. It's very large. Even in a place like Jamaica, we have now reporting 17%. It's more like 20% in my own experience. I was involved in measuring poverty in Jamaica for many years, and I can tell you that our measurements are inherently conservative. And what you have to remember is if we say that, say 20% of the population is below the poverty line, think immediately of another 40% who are just above the poverty line, who very easily can fall within poverty. And in that sense, the numbers are underestimating how serious the problem of poverty is in the region. I need to also point out that the region is a heavily indebted region of the world. Some data suggesting for the last, up to 2018, for the CARICOM Caribbean, are showing the ratio of debt to GDP. And you see that even Barbados is over 100%. It's been declining, and similar in the case of Jamaica, going from over 100% down to, in 2018, less than 100%. The numbers are all generally high. That's the main point. The trends are also important, because what I'm going to suggest is that this indebtedness is the economic dimension of the threat to the region. And what is going to happen is that as the economies contract and GDP goes down, then and countries find themselves borrowing to stay afloat, then the debt to GDP ratio is bound to rise and therefore aggravate, intensify the threat to the region from indebtedness. So that's something that is important to understand about the region at this point in time. The second major threat that we are thinking about is climate change. We are in a highly vulnerable region to natural hazards, tropical storms being the most frequent and the most topical. But we also have, we're also based on earthquake faults. Haiti, for example, and Jamaica are on the same earthquake fault. the earthquake that destroyed Haiti in 2010, Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti in 2010, runs right through Kingston. So I don't know, we're just lucky that somehow Kingston didn't get the tremendous damage as well. Kingston, of course, has had its history of two major earthquakes, one of which destroyed Port Royal famously, and another which destroyed large parts of Kingston. And then there are volcanoes. Indeed, many of the Eastern Caribbean countries are really just tops of volcanoes. One of them exploded in 1997 in the tiny island of Montserrat, and 2/3 of that island now is uninhabitable because the volcano there, Soufriere, is very active. The IPCC forecasts that the region will get more intense storms, rising sea levels, warmer sea surface temperatures, more frequent warm nights, and then the dry seasons will become drier and the wet seasons will become wetter, so that you have an alternating situation before drought, which affects the economy in so many ways, certainly agriculture, and leaves a place prone to fires, and the wetter seasons now, where what we then switch to immediately is flooding because of the denuded forests and the steep slopes of many of the mountainous islands. I think something like that is quite familiar to many of the countries who are represented in this conversation here. So what is this existential threat? In 2010, Norman Girvan, our late esteemed, well-renowned, tremendous thinker and political economist, noted in the aftermath of weather system that became a tropical storm, not a hurricane, not a big hurricane by any means, in 2010, tropical storm Nicole. She sat over St. Vincent for a few days, and the rainfall from tropical storm totally destroyed the banana industry in St. Vincent. And that was the main export for the country. And that weather system moved across the region and did severe damage to Haiti and many other countries. So it is in this reflection that of the impact of hurricanes and tropical storms, of remembering how a hurricane a few years earlier had hit the Cayman Islands so badly that the sea from both sides of the main island of Grand Cayman met in the middle of Grand Cayman, suggesting that the entire island at some point was inundated. This brought to mind the acute climate change related stress that the region is facing, being aggravated by the changes in the climate, and the hazards being aggravated by climate change. Couple that with the acute economic stress as indicated by the debt problem. But again, the debt problem is just static indicators. One has to look and see how the economies have been moving over years. And what you find is that there's a tendency for stagnation. And as I suggested, marginalization from the center of the global economy, which means many of their markets are disappearing. And that, of course, associated with fiscal stress, meaning that the state is, the resources of the state are consumed with repaying debt and therefore unavailable to meet the pressing needs of the society, especially of the working people who came out of colonialism with the anticipation that the conditions of life would eventually improve. And finally, there's the issue of transnational crime, because the Caribbean historically has been a region where money and guns come down from the north, and drugs, whether tobacco, marijuana, cocaine, go up to the north in this circular trade, this circular exchange. And over time, transnational gangs have developed. The Colombian gangs are very famous, so are the Jamaican gangs, many of which have sufficient power to intimidate and even to threaten to dominate some of these microstates within the region. And for this reason, these reasons that Girvan asked the question, is there, how can we manage these existential threats, these threats to the very existence of the region, which forecasts suggest some of the islands will be inundated by the middle of the 21st century, and so on. So I'm suggesting that COVID has added to that situation. Now, here are some indicators of what COVID has done in our region. These are some indicators. Again, one has to be very careful with the numbers in the case of Jamaica. I mean, we know the great United States is suffering with tremendous rates of infection and death from COVID. And we know that there is great underestimation there of the infection. So true, it must be even more so here in the Caribbean, where our capacity for measuring is so much less. What I have given you here is the population, the various cases of infection that have been reported up until a few days ago, the deaths that have come from it, and computed for you the ratio of cases to the population and the rate of death out of those cases. You see that there is a variation, generally very small. And indeed, for the region as a whole, there is about 0.2% of the population has been infected, and the death rate is on average around 2.2%, which is pretty low compared to the global numbers, where globally the averages for the rate of infection of the population is 0.46, which is more than twice the Caribbean, and the death rate is 2.95, which is greater. This is for the world as a whole, which is greater than the numbers for the Caribbean. So those indicators suggest that things are not so bad in the case of the Caribbean when you look at public health. Again, bear in mind that the data is not always what we would like it to be. And the reasons offered for it is that we closed our borders early, so that as islands, there's an advantage. You can close your borders. Some of the land-based territories like Guyana, Suriname, and Belize are not able to do that. And our governments have generally implemented the World Health Organization protocols. And the various regional organizations that have, some of which are specialized to deal with public health issues, have all cooperated very well, which is a good sign for us. Some of it has been attributed to a tendency to a tradition of cooperating in the face of regional natural disasters. So those are the main reasons offered why things looked pretty well. But again, these are static indicators, and one has to pay attention, close attention to the trends and so on. Here's an example of Jamaica, which has been touted internationally as doing particularly well. And all of a sudden comes August, and you see this tremendous surge that occurs and is currently occurring as I'm speaking to you. You can see a similar picture for Bahamas. So this is a dynamic situation, and much of this kind of surge has come from opening up those borders, particularly in the tourist economies. Bahamas has had to close back its economy, especially to people coming from the United States. And of course, all the governments, as everywhere else, are challenged to enforce the compliance to protocols. We too here in Jamaica and throughout the region have relied on curfews and bans to restrict gatherings, but they are all well-known violations associated with super spreading. Until now, we are in a situation where infection isn't so much coming in from abroad, but we are into the phase of community spreading now, which of course explains in part the surge that I showed you in the case of Jamaica. And the main challenge to containment, of course, is that many of our people live in overcrowded conditions. So there's telling them to shelter in place, as the Americans call it, or stay at home, as the Jamaicans say in their own dialect. Uh, in some families, not everybody can be in the house at the same time. Some people sleep while others are out and so on. So these are very overcrowded conditions, which of course facilitates the transmission of the virus, but of course is uncomfortable for people to be cooped up for days and weeks and months now. And then of course, these same people have to hustle to feed their families day by day. Whatever they earn today goes into feeding their families and meeting the basic needs today. So they can't afford to be out, to be locked at home for long periods. These are some forecasts of the economic impact that coming from the IMF. On your left is Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, Suriname, Trinidad, and Tobago. The pale blue line shows the contraction that is expected for the economies. And you see that in the case of the Bahamas, up to 8%. Guyana is a particular case on the right, because with the discovery of oil, suddenly they expected a boom, but they're still expecting a boom, but not as great as they had anticipated earlier. Many of our countries are tourism dependent. There's an index that has been developed based upon the share of export of hard currency earnings that come from tourism, and the share that comes from, and the share of employment generated by that. And those red bars, columns, show the tourism dependency for the countries that we are looking at, with a country like Antigua being extremely high. That's the first of the red bars. And even Jamaica, this red bar to the extreme right here of the first set, up to 40% of the, that's a bit high estimate, but it's very high for the share of tourism earnings in the total hard currency earnings of the country. Here's some data from a recent survey that was done by the IDB on several countries, the impact on loss of jobs and businesses. Jobs are the, I don't know what you call it, mustard color columns, and business closures are the blue columns. And not surprisingly, divided into different income groups, you find that on a whole, job losses and business closures are highest for the lowest income groups. And that in both tourism dependent and commodity dependent countries, you see that there's been a tremendous job loss and business closures as a result of the economic impact of COVID. Now, here is some indicators of what has happened in terms of the social conditions based along and looked at in terms of gender lines. And you'll see that in both cases, food security and diet, women have suffered more than men. On the left, the mustard color shows people who are now hungry as a result, and the blue shows reports that they're eating less healthily. And of course, the case of women are suffering much more than men. On the right is job losses, and of course, women job losses in the case of women are much higher than men. In the case of domestic violence, again, on the basis of large income groups, we are seeing that the report of domestic violence in these close quarters, anxiety-filled homes shows that COVID has impacted there, and primarily, of course, it is the women who feel the impact of that domestic violence. And here's another indicator too of the issue of hunger and people eating less healthily, which I referred to earlier. So The important lesson of all of this is that there's this inextricable link among the three: environment, economy, and the public health. For obvious reasons, I mean, it's self-evident that the economy depends on the environment and impacts it. And the environment is where you get your resources and serves as a sink for the waste from the economy. And so the vulnerability of the economy depends upon the vulnerability of the environment, which itself is vulnerable to both climate change and human abuse. However, we tend to take the environment for granted, and it certainly benefits very little from the economy, where expenditure, for example, on conservation and things to protect the environment are very low from both the public and the private sector. Similarly, the link between economy and the public health has been taken for granted. We assume that governments tend to assume that the labor force will be well enough to go to work, and that in general, the economy will not harm public health. But the major lesson from the COVID crisis is that we need to have a greater sensitivity to the interconnections between the environment and public health and the economy. And that the priorities of public expenditure on public health must be seen as important investments in order to prepare the labor force for productive public work. So now I just want to spend the last few minutes on some ideas on building a new normal, given the reality that I have sketched for you. I think that COVID has created an opportunity to rethink all social processes. I'm just going to give a few examples here. Office space. Now that many people are working from home, that means there's less need for office space. That's going to impact the real estate market. It means also the stimulation of building of offices at home. That shifts the whole cost dimension of many companies where people can work from home. Indeed, the production processes, one has to rethink it. In the United States, for example, we know that restaurants are replacing waiters with digital communication over the telephone and even robots to deliver the food to persons, and moving from dining in the restaurant to taking out. So the production process there is changing, and it suggests that many production processes, especially in the era of robotization, you'll find that robots will be replacing people in production with implications for employment. Education. Up until COVID, if we had a discussion like this about education, our minds would immediately turn to classrooms and students with books and teachers. Well, now we are all facing a situation where students are not in classrooms, students are not using books, they are into tablets, that the teachers now no longer the source of all knowledge and information. There are all kinds of streams of information students can get. So we have to rethink the whole process of education to see how this new mode can be used to shape the citizens that we desire. Health. When COVID struck, immediately in Jamaica, many private doctors closed their offices because they were afraid of getting infected themselves. And of course, with the new personal protective equipment. My daughter is a surgeon. When she goes to work, she looks like an astronaut. Telemedicine is replacing things. And governance, I think, is an area that we have to rethink. We have inherited governance structures from colonial authority. Those governance structures were designed for colonies, to keep people in control in order for them to produce wealth for the mother country. We have become independent, but we haven't changed those governance structures. A simple thing like if a person from the Ministry of Education wants to speak to somebody from the Ministry of Health about how to manage COVID infection in schools, that person in education, that Office of Education, has to communicate with his or her permanent secretary, who communicates with the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Health, who may or may not issue instructions to the person, his counterpart in health. That is not a system that allows for quick decision-making, which is needed for development. And we all know that our government structures have frustrated many development projects. So I think we have to look at it in terms of short, medium, and long run. Of course, they're all related to each other. And the first thing is to negotiate international assistance on concessional terms. Otherwise, heavy debt is just going to make the debt problem worse. And that's important that the big countries, as Professor Ghosh was suggesting last time, that the big countries fund these recoveries in order to stimulate international aggregate demand. We all have to continue to contain the spread of COVID by the various protocols recommended by the World Bank. But as I suggested to you, that's a big challenge in our countries, and it leads to all kinds of social tensions in these small societies. Expanding food production, especially for the domestic market, is critical. Energy and food are the two largest components for these countries. And with the decline in their earnings, they'll be less able to afford imported food. So they have to produce their own. And at this point, governments now have to think of providing the same level of incentives to farmers as they are willing to do for foreign investors. And here's a concrete opportunity of facilitating cooperation within the region between the countries with large land masses like Ghana, Suriname, and Belize, and the smaller countries to produce food for their mutual benefit of their communities, as well as for export, as I'm going to argue. Staying in the short run, we have to raise the level of priority for waste management. COVID is now capturing our attention, but the region is plagued with dengue and various vector-borne diseases, which are thriving in the situation of poor waste management. Of course, we have to protect the vulnerable population as much as we can within the available fiscal space. Now, here's a sharp difference between what I'm suggesting to you and what Professor Ghosh was suggesting. She was suggesting that fiscal space was not a limitation for many of the large countries. But for us, it is a great problem, because once you put money in the hands of people, they go and they buy imported stuff, and that imported stuff then puts pressure on the balance of payments, and then from the balance of payments on the exchange rate into the prices, so that the thing becomes self-defeating. And so we don't have that same mechanism that the big countries have. And we have to innovate against anti-crime strategies. The tendency has been to use military approaches to dealing with the crime, but we have to shift that balance towards using more social programs to attract the energies of youth away from gangs and that kind of antisocial behavior. And most important, I think, in the short run, is to initiate this broad public dialogue, some of which we are doing here today on a global level, because that agenda, even the agenda is not yet defined, but we have to get people thinking through how to reorganize our lives in the face of the persistence of climate change, the debt burden, and more pandemics to come after COVID, I think is most likely. And I am not even included in that major wars. In terms of the medium run, implement what the issues that we come up with in that dialogue in the short run, that dialogue that I was suggesting, that dialogue that should be inclusive of the whole population as well as the people in the diaspora. And of course, aggressive promotion of agro-industries, especially for export to niche markets, because that's really what going to exist, because everywhere in the world, it is the rich people who are surviving and the poor people who are not. They don't have the purchasing power to buy our exports. We have been doing business process outsourcing in the Caribbean now, which is basically call centers. We need to move to a higher level services to be able to, earn more from them, and to transform this from a kind of modern, super duper, low wage activity. And cultural services that we are so good at need to be repackaged for digital markets as well as live markets. Re-engage in the global economy. I raised that at the very beginning. This is all the more difficult because of the disarray of the global economy, with the major trading partners of the Caribbean affected by England and Brexit, and the United States inward turn. And we may well have to consider, again, more seriously expanding our relations with Africa. Digital infrastructure. Everywhere in the world, we need to initiate major upgrading of the digital infrastructure to spread the kiosks, like what India has been doing across the villages and small towns, to allow for people to participate in various ways. And of course, expand training opportunities as rapidly as we can. In terms of the still medium run governance, I mentioned to you the importance of updating our governance processes in order to broaden meaningful participation of people both here and abroad, and to improve the national security by shifting security expenditure from guns to social services that will obviate the need for guns. And finally, in the long run, cooperation, promoting cooperation and collaboration within countries, among the various groups, government, civil society, business, labor, and so on, and between countries, especially with regard to building the regional food economy in the Caribbean, cooperating in the adaptation to climate change, and collaborating and formulating and implementing public health, strong public health safeguards which affect us all. Low carbon strategy, obviously important for most of us here who are energy importers. We won't be able to afford importing energy. Therefore, we have to intensify the drive for investments in renewable resources. Indeed, even the oil producers in the region have committed themselves to that diversification. Reduce the dependence on tourism. We must reduce the dependence on tourism and build a new kind of tourism. Promoting work over the internet. Again, I think this is going to be an important thing for the workforce, both for corporations who are doing the kind of business process outsourcing, as well as for individuals who can earn a living doing various kinds of things over the internet. Inclusiveness. All countries have a problem with inclusiveness. We tend to, we have not been able to find ways of the benefits of development reaching the majority of the population. So we need to be able to looking more, again, at decent work, at living wages, and to provide opportunities for micro, small, and medium businesses. So by way of summary, what I'm suggesting to you is that a sustainable development strategy for the Caribbean is basically greening these economies. And when I say greening, I mean in the sense of building low carbon economies, of adapting to climate change. Mitigation is not so important for us, but we'll have to do some mitigation, and ensuring that economies are inclusive. Now, it also entails an efficient management of our natural resources. And as I suggested to you, we have really been disrespectful. The main export industries and a lot of the poor people struggling for survival have been disrespectful of the environment. So that in the face of these existential threats that I spoke about, vulnerabilities to natural hazards, vulnerability to international economic forces, and social disruptions from violent criminal activity, the long-run focus of the Caribbean must be to build resilient economies. That is, economies that can take these threats as they hit us and bounce back. So I want to say thanks for the opportunity to share this with a bit rushed presentation. So there are lots of things that I hope comes out in the discussion. And maybe in the end, what I've done is just presented old wine, but hopefully I've done so in new wine casks. So with that, I turn over to you, Praveen, and the discussant.
Thank you, Michael, for this very sharp diagnosis of several key issues and giving us lots of insights. We will come to some questions, etc., later to you. But before that, let's hear Lynn, and she would reflect on some of the issues that you have raised, your analysis, your prescriptions, and if she has to add anything to it, and I'm sure she has, she would take those issues into account as well. With that, Lynn, you're most welcome. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Praveen, and thank you, Dr. Witter. I don't think we discussed the Caribbean enough. So this was much more than a presentation. It was also a lesson, a refreshing of our history. My discussion is around three broad themes. One around movements broadly, and another around the structure of capitalism, and another around political arrangements. So first, you pointed us to Norman Girvan. And I found something he cites citing C.L.R. James, that the great artist is universal because he is national, rooted in his or her society, and reflecting and relating to the social forces of the time and place. And I think this is a demand that can also be made of progressives everywhere. So, I'm struck by its political significance, the political significance of this statement in this present moment, when the COVID pandemic has both, and also compelled a renewed global South dialogue, like what we are having here. This dialogue series came out of what we were confronted with. So this dialogues regarding where to go next in search of socialist alternatives, and so we are seeing a kind of reconstitution or a desire for a reconstitution might be arrayed against capitalism. But anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism we also have to contend with the reality that there will be a pushback as the global forces of accumulation also reconstitute, to recoup their losses, to regain control over financial and human resources. So my question in relation to this is, at this time, and drawing from your analysis of the Caribbean, I know you've already said some of this in your talk, but could you reflect more on where you would locate the most sort of potent social forces of the pandemic? Are there, what are there things? What is it tangibly, if at all, that we have in defense of people, in defense of nature, and sovereignty against the neoliberal response to economic recovery, which we are all expecting? Professor Ghosh was also talking about this. Are there new kinds of solidarities or immediate political actions and social actions that we can draw from? Secondly, on the structure of capitalism, and this I'm going to ask you a very gendered question, partly because that is my interest, and also because you mentioned some of it in your presentation. We are, perhaps for the first time, at least in my lifetime, and on a global scale, we are confronted with the responsibility of dealing seriously with a substructure of capitalism that is embedded in capitalism's accumulation model. And this is the question of social reproduction. I'm sure you've encountered this. It's something everyone is talking about somehow. So we are confronted with this, and we can in a number of ways. One is in relation to the ongoing metabolic relationship of capitalism to nature and the impending climate is a kind part of the standstill in the pandemic came from this to do so. Whether due to, and I'm talking specifically here of the lockdown period. So whether due to the enforced lockdown or the inability to command labor power. So this is I'm talking temporarily now. But there's also another labor whose extent was intensified because when you think of social reproduction, and it's a function that is played by household production, the market, and partly the state. And we saw collapse of the market. I mean, of the market function, through that collapsed. The state stepped in a minimum. Action and reproduction have largely sustained urban needs, much less than was predicted. The early predictions was that these folks would be wiped and so on. But about more than 85% of the population, and at the heart which accounts for a large majority of non-commercial food production. And of course, this non-commercial food production lost jobs, actually working more, right? And this pandemic. So here we have a crisis of global proportion.
I think because of the poor connectivity, we are having difficulty with Lynn. Lynn, are you able to reconnect?
Professor Jha, Lynn cannot be seen online at this point.
Yeah, so
The network has dropped, so she's not. Her name is not.
Praveen,
Michael, I hope you.
Praveen, maybe Lynn can send me her comments in writing, and I could respond to them and share them with you.
Yes. That Priyanka, can you please send a message to Lynn if she could very briefly.
Lynn.
Professor Jha, she is online now.
She's
Dr.
back.
Lynn,
She's back.
have you joined back?
Her audio is not configured yet, so you have to wait.
Okay.
All right, that shouldn't take too long, right, Rajiv?
Let's wait, I think.
Michael, in the meantime, you probably did not hear some of what Lynn said, but maybe a couple of other responses. So, for instance, okay, Lynn has joined back, so let us hear her first. Lynn, it may be a good idea for you to switch off the video because you were not very clearly audible. Okay, so if you can just make your points, and if there is a difficulty, then if you want to make some very pointed remarks and want to send that to Michael, yeah, write that down. That would be very good, very, very sharply. So, the choice is yours. If you think that you can go ahead the way it suits you. So please, Lynn. Lynn, can you hear me?
Dr. Lynn, if you can just switch off your video and then try speaking just with your mic on.
Okay, sorry about. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm not sure where. So I'm not sure what but so I was in this relation. You spoke of you made a conclusion in your own in your work, and you're saying that which I think is a very significant conclusion, that you draw that COVID has revealed the inextricable links among the environment, economy, and public health. And forces us to review ways. My question to you is logical criminalizing the rights of those whose survival depends on nature, culture.
I'm not hearing.
Yeah. Lynn.
And also, do you see the possibility of the emergence of new agrarian questions, or the likelihood in the wake of still inaudible?
Lynn, unfortunately, your connection is not
not here.
Clear at all. So it may be a good idea for you to just write your questions in Q&A in the chat box and send it to the group or to Michael. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
No, it began okay, meaning connection was okay, but then we sort of progressively it became worse. So, and the connection is not serving you well. So sorry about that.
I can try and ask, now that you can hear, I can try and ask there's one final question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so the final one is the final question I want to put to you is on the idea of democracy or governance, what you're talking about. which is, it's a question that preoccupies me a great deal. And I think it's something that it has to be a condition of any progressive anti-capitalist or anti-imperialist agenda. So more specifically, how do we move beyond the neoliberal state's investment in violence, which is bounded with the question of the inequalities that you're describing? We've seen violence as neoliberalism's response to demands for social justice, for redistribution, for recognition. It is, it's something that became again evident in the pandemic period when we saw the enforcement of physical control measures morph into an excuse for the militarization of state responses. Of course, we see an increase in domestic violence. The damage of neoliberalism has been felt in our economies for quite a while. And more recently, it is manifesting through the identitarian superstructure, of right-wing nationalism, racism, fascism, and so on. And it seems that the option that the world's poor are being offered is the mobility of their economic resources.
Okay.
Commodity exports and so on, the political freedoms, tourism in the case of the Caribbean, without protections against wage discrimination and marginalization. So in short, there is no democratic option to globalization. So are there ways in which, this is my question to you, ways in which the current crisis has made you reconcile to democracy? Do the political choices that we might be compelled to make, and here I'm thinking of, the radical land redistribution in Zimbabwe, as a political choice, or reclaiming that the world's poor, the poor of the global south these choices that we might be compelled to make, do they the idea of democracy redundant in the third world, or more hard any of it? I'm quite sorry about my connection.
Okay, Lynn, is that all from your side, or Lynn, can you hear me?
Yes,
so is that for the moment, shall we sort of take it that that is all from you, and you can come back again later, and I hope with better connectivity?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Lynn, for unfortunately, sort of because of the connection, I think Michael probably will not be able to respond too much to you, but I leave that to Michael, whatever he has managed to gather. And Michael, let me add a couple of questions from the audience which have appeared in the chat box. So one of these is from Damien, and he is very appreciative of your discussion, and he has two questions. One, what is the impact of financial flows linked to tax haven policies in the countries in the Caribbean? And second question is, what is the situation and or role of the colonial or semi-colonial territories and countries of the Caribbean. He mentions Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, and so on, in the existential threat of the region. Then we have a comment and question from Comrade Sister Georgie. I read it out. The Caribbean case sounds very much like the situation in many parts of Africa, particularly the landlocked countries in the Sahel. Although these are large territories compared to small island nations, even the solutions being proposed are relevant, very useful in that regard. You know what you have said. The question is, so this was the comment, and the question is, what precisely do we mean by the new normal that our countries are facing, and how is this different from past periodic crises? For instance, recent global financial, energy, and food crisis. Let me stop here for the moment. There are other questions as well. Ricardo and others, I'll bring you in a moment, but let Michael respond to these first so that his plate is not too full. Michael, floor is yours.
Are you hearing me? Are you hearing me, Praveen?
Yes, yes, Michael.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you. I wasn't sure. Well, let me start with Lynn. I really have not heard Lynn's comments at all. And I would really urge her to write them out, as well as any other persons who we can't address fulsomely in this session we are having now. And I would be happy to write responses to as best as I can to each of them. And I really urge this because I have made a presentation to beg a lot of questions. And therefore it will help me certainly and hopefully help others if we continue the dialogue in a way in which I'm clear about what is being asked. In the case of Lynn is asking, I think, she was asking some very pertinent questions about how the social forces in the country are how they have been impacted differentially and how they would participate in any kind of post-COVID world. I hesitate to guess at what she's saying because it is quite profound, and I don't want to just go on at length about that without being sufficiently targeted at what she's asking. So I would rather defer to that. I will make some observations that may be pertinent to what she's asking, but I would not want for what I say now to pass for any kind of a fulsome response to what she's asking. But my impression is that she's asking some very pertinent questions that would force me to go in much deeper into the social structure of the Caribbean countries. And there we begin to tread on some dangerous ground, because the differences then become important beyond the level of abstraction in which I pitched the discussion. However, as I say, I could go into some things, but I don't want to misinterpret what she was saying. So let me pass on what Lynn is saying. Lynn has asked about location of social forces and problems of social reproduction. That's all I know. I don't know specifically what she wanted. As far as the impact of tax haven flows, well, there are some countries that, like Cayman Islands, for example, and some of the Virgin Islands, that that's their main line of activity, has been havens for and tax avoidance and tax evasion, really, in the big countries. And what has happened is that they have all come under tremendous pressure as under suspicion of money laundering. And really and truly, the big countries, particularly starting with the Obama administration, wanted really to capture back some of the tax income that they were losing. So that what you have is a problem where, for example, Antigua decides to become a tax haven, and very soon it is blacklisted by the Europeans and blacklisted by the Americans, and that presents all kinds of problems for those countries accessing international funding and so on. So the impact has been that there are few countries that have done well over the years as tax havens. But when other countries started to try to get into that line of activity, it caused a tremendous reaction from the governments of the United States and the Europeans. And basically, their approaches have been stillborn. Indeed, many of these countries spend a lot of time proving that they are not money laundering facilities. So I would think that in the last 5 to 10 years, the impact has tended to be negative on the region as a whole, though it is clear that few countries, Cayman Islands being one, are still benefiting, though perhaps not as much as they used to benefit before. What is the situation of colonies that are still in existence? It's a very good question, because this notion of Caribbean independence tends to ignore the fact that there are many, many colonies still in the Caribbean, some that are given all kinds of names that sound like they're not colonies. For example, Puerto Rico is an associated state of the territory of the United States, but clearly a colony in the way it is treated, and treated with quite a lot of disrespect by the current government. In the case of the French territories of Martinique and Guadeloupe, they are departments of France, which means that their independent, their existence as entities is not even recognized. They are part of France. It's a total negation of these societies. And then there's places like the dependencies that the British have and the Dutch have and so on. Well, ironically, if you look at some of the data on some of these countries, the macroeconomic data, they seem quite impressive. High rates of GDP, low rates of unemployment. But if you probe deeper into the society, you find that the people who are really citizens of those societies are in many ways socially and politically marginalized, even though they may be enjoying a fairly good standard of living, a material standard of living, a fairly good material standard of living. I don't know really what is the situation on as far as COVID has been on them. There is some data, but I overlooked it in this presentation. Certainly, they're all subject to the problems of natural hazards. Puerto Rico is still not recovered from the hurricane that hit it 2 years ago, and the Virgin Islands too have been under severe pressure. They have themselves been involved in all kinds of interregional smuggling rings and so on. So they certainly have that problem of international crime as well. Indebtedness, it's hard to say what indebtedness is in some of these colonies. As you know, Puerto Rico is in very bad shape with respect to the US government. So I suspect that the conditions are very similar in many ways, but their governments have less options to address the problems themselves or the social implications of those problems. In the case of Puerto Rico, there's currently tremendous instability in the government. What is the meaning of a new normal? Well, that's what I'm suggesting that we in the Caribbean need to think through. And by extension, I believe everybody needs to think through what is their new normal. In the case of the English-speaking Caribbean, I mean, let's take two opposite cases. The Cubans had a revolution and defined the kind of society that they want. In the case of the English-speaking Caribbean, the negotiation for independence was really one-sided. We essentially took the governance structure and the constitution that the British government were happy with. The Caribbean people have not themselves engaged in what kind of society that they want. And the very narrow political process that is, well, it is quite widespread at the level of getting votes. But in terms of decision making, once in power, the governments operate, most of them have tended to operate without very much consultation of the general public. So that I think that in a way, COVID allows us to rethink all of those processes, governance processes, economic processes, social processes that we have tended to accept. Just tweak here and tweak there and make a little change here and a little change there, but have not really thought out what it is that we as people want. What kind of education do we want? What kind of health system do we want? Do we want a health system that caters to upper income people with, diseases that are more common in the developed countries? Or do we want a health system that also addresses the problems of good health, of preventative medicine for the majority of the poor people who can't afford specialized health services? We haven't thought through these kinds of things. We have just accepted the infrastructure that came from the colonial period. So I don't know what the new normal is. The new normal is something that has to come out of a democratic process, which is one of the things I think Lynn was referring to. And I am arguing for a national dialogue within each country that brings out, that facilitates people expressing what they think and what they need, what they feel. Now, this is not a trivial exercise. For example, government of Jamaica will say, oh, we're consulting the people. So let's have a meeting, and we'll keep a meeting in a fancy hotel with air conditioning and an agenda the meeting is governed by Robert's Rules of Order. And then you bring in rural peasants and fishermen into that situation where they're totally intimidated. They don't understand the language. They don't understand the processes. So in fact, it is really a sham. It does not really capture what these people want. So I am arguing instead for a dialogue that meaningfully includes people in the society, the broadest participation in the society, both those who are resident here and those who are in the diaspora. Now, that seems to me to be an extension of the democratic process, which up to now is fairly limited to regular elections. Indeed, it's very difficult to break that notion that democracy should go beyond just elections. We here in Jamaica had a few years, 3 or 4 years, in which in the 1970s, when the Manley government tried to extend that democracy to the economy by way of promoting cooperatives and collective forms of production, by way of distributing land on a leasehold basis, by way of promoting various kinds of worker participation in factories. Well, it was short-lived, right? And one of the costs of the IMF intervention in Jamaica in particular, but the region more generally, has been the stifling of attempts to develop those kinds of democratic processes. So I am saying I don't know what a new normal is, but I have my own ideas. But I think those ideas are just part of a stream of ideas that must come from the broadest representation of the population here and abroad, out of which we could distill or synthesize some notion of what is a new normal, what is the kind of way in which the societies would want to live given the realities that we live in. We must bear in mind that the Caribbean is very, very small, that we are easily dominated by the big powers, and therefore the room for operation for us is very narrow. And in our case here, we have been held in check. Our social movements have been held in check by the hegemonic powers in the Western Hemisphere. So there's very little room for us to maneuver. I am suggesting that in the COVID period, where the global situation is in a bit of a disarray, and the big countries that we have traditionally been tied to have turned inward, England in Brexit, United States in Make America Great Again. It opens up space for us in the Caribbean to try to negotiate relations with other parts of the world, and in that sense to be able to facilitate the development of the society. Those are just some quick off the head responses to the questions, but even those questions that I tried to address, I would be very happy to receive them in writing and try to develop a more fulsome answer.
Okay, thanks, Michael. A few more questions. First, from Ricardo. Ricardo, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I have two short questions. The one, I think Professor Witter started answering that, is in the context of the US-China rivalry. Where is the Caribbean located within the context of China, was also as a rising economy and country, and where do you situate yourself? And is that a possible option of what in Zimbabwe was called the Look East policy? My second question relates to organized crime, and I think in your suggestions you situated in terms of the gangs in social welfare policy, but I want to ask, do you see imperialism and the forms of as also a form of organized crime? And how is organized crime structured? Are you specifically referring to gangs within the working class area, or organized crime within the different layers that sort of plays the traditional role of keeping a check on the working class in general? So I just wanted to ask that. And then the third, do you think that Keynesian solutions in the current context of a global crisis is a way out? As you say, imperialism it manifests itself particularly as new colonialism. So these are just my three questions, but thank you for a wonderful presentation and input. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ricardo. Michael, before you respond to Ricardo, please take a few more questions and you can combine them, because these are partly related, but not fully. One is what linkages can be drawn between commodity production and tourism dependencies and the local systems of the Caribbean? Local food production, processing, marketing, and distribution. What about food trade? How much local food is imported? Then food insecurity statistic is grim. Is the case lack of food availability or a question of accessibility? Then there is a question from Leonard Nurse, which is again, first thanking you for your wonderful presentation, and then what specific changes would you suggest that are critical and that are within our capability and resource capacity to implement reasonably swiftly so that the situation improves? We have a question from Nancy from Harare, which is, can you comment on the push from the Caribbean around reparations? What can Africa and let me just, what has been the impact of upheavals in Latin America, especially Brazil, Bolivia, for the Caribbean's ability to get concessions on the international stage? What can Africa and the Caribbean governments do more to strengthen cooperation on the international stage, particularly on climate change responses. And then one more question, you can combine these. This is from my colleague Archana Prasad. Don't you think that the pandemic has to be seen in the context of the rise of right-wing, especially fascistic tendencies in the many parts of the world? In fact, the pandemic has been used to throttle the space for protest in many places. How can the alternative be built in this situation? I think the changing nature of the state and the struggle to protect space of struggle is becoming as important as dealing with the pandemic in a democratic and socially sensitive way. Please dwell on the impact of the pandemic on social and political movements. We will come back to maybe a couple of more responses in a minute, but or in a few minutes, depending on how much time we have, Michael, but very profound. And I quite like Ricardo's idea of crime in the most fundamental kind of way that we need to deal with, which is the biggest of the organized crime, imperialism and things like that. Okay, Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, there's a movie called about a famous American Indian chief called Little Big Man. And he once described the problem of the white man is that he does not seek the center of the universe. Well, I think these questions are asking me to find the center of the universe. They are profound questions that have, been bothering me too as well, but I'll try my best to respond to what I can. Okay, so let's start with the China question. The Chinese are very important very interested in the region as a whole, Latin America and the Caribbean. It seems to me that they have 100, 200-year perspective on encircling the West. Perhaps the road that they're building around the world to facilitate their own trade and economic growth is exemplified, is in part what they're interested in the Latin America and the Caribbean. They have, in particular in the Caribbean, a pretty heavy footprint in terms of infrastructure. And in the desperation of governments that can't get international assistance and are under pressure from their populations, cheap Chinese assistance is very attractive. Now, the problem that I have with the relationship is that the Chinese think in hundreds of years, whereas our Caribbean leaders think in terms of 4 years to 5 years with the next election. There can't be any serious negotiation between the both. So quite frankly, I think the Caribbean people, the Caribbean governments are not even engaged properly in what the Chinese are about and are at risk of sharing their generosity without seeing what the long run implications are for their own development. So that is an open question right now, and I don't think that we are in a position to answer it. Not even our scholars, I think, have fully understood exactly what the Chinese intentions are and what the long run implications are. As you know, there are all kinds of stories coming out from all over the world, Africa in particular, about Chinese debt, the debt trap that the Chinese use to leverage their position and access to resources in the case of Africa. Here in the Caribbean, it is not so much about resources, but I think geopolitical location that they are interested in. That's my guess. But that is certainly an important question that you're asking. About gangs, I think you have to look on both sides of it. I generally accept your view of the plundering of the region. I mean, we certainly have been plundered here in the Caribbean by colonialism and by extension imperialism. That's not a problem with me here. I'm referring to the social movements that generally are emerging from working class people, but are manipulated by large capitalists. So for example, the drug trade, one can look at the drug trade as, corner gangs who are moving cocaine through the region. But the truth is, behind them are banks who are financing these exchanges. So that there is an interconnection between the gangs and the social structure as far as they facilitate the laundering of money and so on. That's one side. But the other side of it is to recognize that the gangs play the role of providers of benefits to the communities from which they come. And that is what helps them on the ground, insofar as they are protected by the people who they assist with resources for the children to go to school and food and so on like that. So I think you have to look at the positive, the side of it that appears positive to the population, namely the way in which they contribute to the welfare of their communities. But on the other hand, it comes the way in which they are tied in to the oppressive, exploitative social structure within the Caribbean and between the Caribbean and the hegemonic powers around, particularly in the case of the United States. It is something well worth exploring, the way in which you put it, but I think we have to look at both sides of it. The way in which they are, in fact, a voice of the poor people who are asserting a space within an oppressive, unequal environment, but in the process are themselves being manipulated by those who have the levers of power in the social system. Keynes is, Keynes is many things, but I think that maybe the most relevant thing is the notion of expanding government expenditure in order to stimulate the economy in a period of recession. I'm suggesting that that has limited relevance in a Caribbean where expenditure by the state immediately is translated into imports, and in the condition where the state is not able to earn hard currency, that pressure ultimately comes down on the exchange rate and in a sense backfires with the inflation ultimately. There is room for that, however, that expenditure. And therefore, the challenge in the Caribbean is how to use that expenditure efficiently. One of the problems I have with the existing governance structure that we have inherited is the way in which it is inefficient in public expenditure and in the way in which it is skewed towards those who are already well-to-do, who already have wealth, and not sufficiently towards those who are in need. So my position is that to the limits of the Keynesian solution, in terms of the fiscal capabilities of the states, which are incredibly indebted, I agree with expansion wholeheartedly. And I think the state ought to play a much greater role in Caribbean development than has happened under this neoliberal period that Lynn referred to, in which the state has been marginalized in terms of social expenditure, but expanded in terms of providing national security, especially for private property and for repayment of debt. So in that sense, the state has been hijacked by the international institutions, international financial institutions. So I think that there's a limit to the Keynesian solution, but certainly it has more relevance to the development process than the free-for-all, free market approach that the neoliberals have been promoted. Linkages with tourism, that's a major challenge. And I was trying to suggest that those linkages, well, Islam will recognize that the linkages are very important, because the truth of the matter is that I have seen no study of any tourist economy which shows that tourism is a net benefit to the economy. All of the reports of governments show what the gross earnings are. Yes, we earn so many $1 billion a year based upon estimates of tourist expenditure. But no one has been able to track down the total costs in earning those billions each year, so that we really don't know if there's a net benefit. And one of the reasons for that is because a lot of what the tourists consume is imported. food being very important. And there have been attempts to deal with, to improve the local content of the tourist diet. But there again, without any government restrictions on the hoteliers, they can easily ship in vegetables from Miami rather than buying vegetables from the farmer next door to the hotel. So it requires a posture on the part of the state to provide some degree of incentives to the agricultural producers to increase the linkages between agriculture and tourism, in particular with regard to the purchases of food. And there have been very bad stories, because what happens is that many of the hotels set up contracts with farmers, take long to pay them, during which time the farmer loses out, and eventually the unequal power between the individual small farmer and the large hotel chain ultimately leads to the small farmers being ripped off if they don't have protection from the state. In the Caribbean, we don't really have so much a problem of food availability, because people can still forage in a part of the world that nature has been very generous to, in terms of the way in which the nature provides foodstuffs. The problem is that we have, from the days of slavery, habits of food consumption that are not supported by our capabilities. So we are large rice and corn consumers, but most of us can't grow rice and corn. The big territories, Belize, Suriname, and Guyana, for example, could and do grow some rice and corn. I'm suggesting that that sort of thing be expanded to reduce the import of vegetable protein and animal protein from North America and Europe. So we could do it in the region, but it would require cooperation. An island that is relatively big in the Caribbean, like Jamaica, cannot produce rice and corn economically to meet its needs. So it would require cooperation. And so it is not so much food, but the quality of food. And a lot of that has to do with people's taste patterns, that people are addicted to wheat, bread, dumplings, all kinds of pastries, but we don't grow wheat to produce the flour. So that's a part of the colonial legacy. What kind of changes could be for swift implementation in the region? Well, I think governments' backs are against the wall, or are certainly going to be against the wall over the next course of the year or so. And so maybe this is the time for civil society to press home with a vision of what is the new normal that they want to have. So I am hoping that by calling for this national dialogue in the various Caribbean countries, it would stimulate a process of rebuilding civil society. And here I can just make a quick comment that I think Lynn was trying to probe. One of the problems with neoliberalism is that it has broken up civil society. Our traditional community organizations, our labor movements, etc., have been shattered by this free market approach, in which governments have, one, allowed investors to come in and get away with not implementing labor laws. By the way, the Chinese are very guilty in that respect. And by the way in which individualism, rank individualism, has been promoted by public policy over cooperation. So that civil society in the region is extremely weak at this present time. Labor unions hardly exist, except in name. And therefore, the kind of channels for pressure from the population are not that great. And this is a danger, in my view, because in these difficult circumstances, it is a recipe for anarchic behavior, whether in terms of violently ripping off other people's property, or simply developing predatory practices of begging and fraud and various kinds of things like that in order to survive. Reparations in the Caribbean, there are small groups. There's official groups that in support of reparations, and there are active interest groups. University of the West Indies has a Center for Reparations now, doing research and so on. But I don't think reparations has caught into the consciousness of the mass of the population in the way one would have expected it to. And that has to do with first of all, a lack of education, two, an association of reparations with Black nationalist, strong Afrocentric movements, which some of the population are not inclined to. And it also has to do with suspicion as to what would happen to the reparations anyway if they were paid. Would it reach down to the ordinary people in the society? So there is a reparations movement in the Caribbean, both unofficial and official, but in my view, not as strong as it ought to be. Cooperation for, well, I'm in full support for any kind of cooperation within the region and between the region and the rest of the world. One of the difficult, some years ago, we had a movement called the Afro-Caribbean and Pacific countries that cooperated in negotiating Lome treaties with the European Union, particularly about the exports of primary products like sugar and so on. The Europeans have been quite successful in splitting out the Caribbean from the Africans and the Asians, and even splitting up Africa itself so that they have agreements with different parts of Africa rather than Africa as a whole. So we do find ourselves in a situation where attempts that were made in the 1970s as part of this third world approach of cooperation, trade union of the poor, Michael Manley used to call it, we find that a lot of those cooperative movements have been split by, let us say, a neoliberal thrust to undermine collective movement by developing countries and to promote the free play of the market forces. So I would certainly support the extension of the cooperation I spoke about within the Caribbean with the relevant countries internationally over especially the issue of debt and climate change. And what about the pandemic in the context of the right wing? Well, I don't think the right wing people caused the pandemic, but I do think that the right wing governments are using the pandemic in the ways that it suits itself. I suppose that the United States and Brazil are good examples of right-wing governments who are less than sensitive to the impact of the pandemic on sections of the population, and who may be using it as a way in which it curtailing individual liberty. But there again, now we have to look at both sides. I mean, there's a call for individual liberty by right-wing nationalists themselves, which ultimately, to my mind, is a disrespect for the collective action of societies in order to deal with a common problem, in this case, the coronavirus. At the same time, one can see where it would be used to suppress social movements, as, for example, Mr. Trump wants to do with what he thinks is this great organization called Antifa, but really it's just young people protesting against the rise of fascist movements. So again, this is just, I feel pretty bad about the kind of rough, crude, and incomplete responses that I've been making to these profound questions. So I would really appreciate if they could be sent to me in writing, that I could be a little bit more respectful to the people who are asking them.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for covering a vast canvas. As is also very clear from the responses to you, as it happens, there are many more questions, but we have run out of the time. And apart from questions, there is huge appreciation for you for your remarks and the coverage of the issues. So I would request the participants, as you suggested, to send the questions to you in writing and then get into a fuller conversation. That would be indeed much more worthwhile. But you don't have to respond to these questions, but I'm simply mentioning at least two of these. One, Rodney Reed, which says that spaces for change have opened up during due to this crisis internally, externally? Is there any shift in the mindset to strategically exploit these open spaces to make changes to address a whole range of issues, energy security, public health infrastructure, and so on and so forth? Then we have someone who wants to sort of know from you about is Brexit actually getting inward or a strategy to move outward along the older patterns of, historical, let's say, colonial terrains? Yeah, so again, I mean, that's a very interesting way of thinking about what some of these arrangements may mean and so on. Lynn, are you there? Or if I just wanted to know if at least tangentially, given the problem of connectivity, Walter was able to engage with some of the important issues you raised, at least tangentially. And do you want to add one last word before I thank everyone? Lynn?
No last word, but a lot of what I was asking, I think Michael responded to through the other questions. So thank you very much.
Okay, great. So it was telepathy. Lynn? Okay.
Yeah, I guess so.
All right. Okay. So, Michael, there you are. Okay, great. So we have to now close it because we are behind the designated slot, the total time assigned for us. Let me remind everyone that the next session in our dialogue series will be on October 21st with Professor Arturo Guillen from the Autonomous Metropolitan University in Mexico City. October 21st, same time, Wednesday again. And Arturo will speak on coronavirus crisis or a new stage of global crisis of capitalism, which obviously will connect with many of the issues that Michael was raising today. With that, let me thank all our friends, everyone who participated, most of all, Michael and Lynn, for their wonderful presentation and remarks. Every other participant who raised a question and concern. And I'm sorry that we have not been able to do justice in a full manner to all these questions. But as I suggested, please write to Michael for a fuller kind of response from him. Thanks also to our tricontinental logistics team, which includes Joseph, Freedom, Nabjeet, Isha, Rajiv, Lalit, Priyanka, Susan, and Julio, and all our partners. So with that, please give me permission to close this session. And wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night.
One
Stay
love.
well.
Thank you, Praveen.
Thank you. Thank you again for, yeah. So with that, we close this session. Thank you for being with us. And we look forward to our continued association. Thank you.